Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm excited to introduce this virtual event with Alastair G. and Dani Anguiano presenting their co-authored book, Fire in Paradise, An American Tragedy. I hope you're all well and safe and hanging in there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight virtually. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series on Wednesday, April 23rd at 7 p.m., we'll host celebrated author and science journalist Annalee Newitz for their new book, Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, in conversation with historian and sci-fi writer Arkady Martine. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. We also have a Science Research Public Lectures YouTube channel where you can view previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our authors at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Fire in Paradise on harvard.com, as well as links to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you to all of you for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science, because it really, really matters in this difficult time and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Alastair G. is an award-winning editor and reporter at The Guardian, who has also written for The New Yorker Online, The New York Times, and The Economist. Dani Anguiano writes for The Guardian and was previously a reporter for the Chico Enterprise Record. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tonight, they'll be discussing their co-authored investigation into the devastation of the 2018 wildfire in Paradise, California. Covering both the science behind wildfires and the intimate, powerful stories of the people affected by the disaster, Fire in Paradise is a comprehensive look at the driving forces behind a cataclysm that, while unprecedented in its time, may be a frightening roadmap for the future of our Western landscape and beyond. Dan Egan says, G and Anguiano's on-the-ground reporting from California's deadliest wildfire is so riveting and evocative that you can almost smell the smoke, not just from the oaks and pines, but from all the scorched vinyl-sided homes, melted car tires, and exploding propane tanks. And Adam Higginbotham calls Fire in Paradise a gripping and meticulously reported account of how one California community was wiped from the map, and a terrifying bellwether of the mounting personal costs of the world's climate emergency. We are so pleased to be hosting them here tonight. The digital podium is yours, Alastair and Dani.
Hello, we're so excited to be here with you all tonight.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to our hosts, the Harvard Bookstore, and we're delighted, as Dani said, to be here and tell you about our book, which is published in paperback tomorrow. We thought that we might start with a short reading from the book, a part of the book, early in the book, that really sets the scene for the book and for the fire. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we came to the book, and then we'd love to take some questions, and we'd love to answer any questions you may have about Paradise, about wildfires, about climate change, California in the West, and also what this coming fire season may hold for us. So I'll start, and then Dani will take over. We'll read for about 10, 15 minutes. And as I said, this is an early chapter in the book. Before many people in Paradise knew that there was a fire on the morning of November 8th, 2018, it announced its presence with strange portents. Churning through the friable brush in the river canyons and in the community of Concal, drawing power from the wind, it watercolored the atmosphere and flung little bits of itself far into the distance. At a home in Eastern Paradise, A man took his dog out into the yard for its morning exercise when he realized that the lawn was covered in burned leaves. It was so dark when another local rose at 8 a.m. that he thought the sun hadn't risen yet, though when he looked up, he saw a red reflection in the murk. A senior went to a doctor's appointment and found that no one had shown up for work, but from somewhere in the distance, he could hear metallic explosions. And at the Cypress Meadows nursing home, a manager was standing outside around 7:50 a.m. when a maintenance worker ran over holding a charred piece of bark. This just came out of the sky. It was on fire. In Paradise, a 44-year-old homemaker called her daughter's high school to ask whether classes had been cancelled owing to the plume she could see on the eastern horizon. They weren't going to cancel classes for smoke, they told her. After all, fires were a regular part of life in Paradise. So she and the two teenagers hopped into the car and drove to Paradise High. On the way, they noticed that the pines were covered in ash, as if there had been a blizzard. In Eastern Paradise, a former nurse was trying to motivate herself to get up out of bed when her 10-year-old daughter skipped into her room in raptures over the sunrise. "It's so beautiful this morning," she told her mother. She asked for her mum's phone so she could take a picture of it. The 47-year-old, who struggled with a rare disease that caused pain so debilitating it had ended her career, forced herself out of bed to look at the dusky sky. When she opened the door to let the family's barking dog out, she saw that her garden was veiled with smog. And a few miles away, when Patricia Smith walked to her daughter's house, along the path that separated it from her own cottage, a black feather drifted past her nose. Smith had come to America in 1983 from the British town of Boston and had mostly lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. But in 2017, she, her husband, and her daughter's family had moved to a wooded 5-acre spread in Paradise that they felt absurdly lucky to have been able to afford. Smith's windows faced the forest. It was so splendidly secluded, you could walk around the cottage naked if you felt so inclined. That morning, her daughter's alarm had not gone off, and they'd all slept in late. At 8:30 a.m., Smith's granddaughter bounded over to the cottage to wake her up and tell her about the fire. Me being English, I'm like, "Oh wait, I've got to make a cup of tea," Smith said. She drank half of it and had the cup in hand when the feather floated past, inches from her face. Bending down to take a look, she found it warm to the touch. It wasn't from a bird. It was a charred wooden ember. She looked up. The horizon was red, but the entire rest of the sky was black. It was hypnotic and beautiful and very, very wrong. She jogged the rest of the way to her daughter's, spilling the remaining tea, and said, "We have to get out of here."
I'll pick up the next section. Hopefully you can hear me okay. For the Paradise Police, these warning signs were a call to action. Officer Rob Nichols had been roused at 4 a.m. by angry winds. Finally rising at 7 from a fitful sleep, he saw a rust-colored sky. While his wife helped their 2 young children get ready for school, Nichols called the station. A colleague told him about the blaze, but said Paradise would probably be fine. A 22-year-old rookie cop, Kyle Shuki, had arrived at the Paradise police station at 7:15 and was waiting for Nichols in a day of field training. He had been with the department for a month. It was quiet as he sat next to an officer catching up on paperwork. But soon he noticed a flurry of calls coming in, as residents asked about the thick black vapor outside their doors and if a fire had sparked in town. "As far as I know, it's north of Concal," the calm dispatcher told one woman. "So far, we're not in any danger." She rushed off the call as phones jangled in the background. At 7:26 a.m., another caller remarked nervously, "Looking out our backyard, it looks it's kind of close." As Nichols arrived at work, ash was falling from the sky and dusting the black and white police cruisers. He was walking toward the door in the station's back lot when Shuki and another officer ran out. They were getting calls for multiple spot fires all around Paradise, and Nichols and the trainee were tasked with finding one just down the road from the Taco Bell in the middle of town. "I'm driving today," Nichols said. "It would be better to have someone who knew the roads well behind the wheel." Pulling out of the station, Nichols called his wife and told her to pack the car, take the kids, and flee. As the officers neared the location of the call, Nichols spotted his wife's aunt and her granddaughter standing outside a home on Nunley Road. He pulled over and told them, "There's a big fire. You need to get out. You need to evacuate." Just a mile from the station, they found what all the auguries had been pointing toward. In awe, they stared at an 80-foot ponderosa pine that towered over a central neighborhood of about 30 homes. There was a fire burning around the tree in a wide circle. Nichols, who had spent a season fighting fires in his youth, knew that the area must have been hit by a firebrand. The flames were working their way up the trunk, and they were loud, making the dry bark and needles crackle like a fire on a camping trip. Embers were spewing into the air amid the surrounding homes and pines. Nichols and Shuki raced from the cruiser and jumped over a 4-foot chain-link fence to get a closer look. The extinguisher Shuki had to hand was no match for the engulfed tree. Nichols tried a garden hose, but nothing came out. The lot was vacant and likely had no water service. "Paradise S-15, we need a fire truck," Nichols said over the radio, identifying himself by his radio call sign. "We got a pretty big fire here that's involving a large tree." The dispatcher responded moments later, "There's no resources available." Nichols was shocked. This could only mean that every firefighter in town was already occupied somewhere else, and that what was happening in front of him was likely happening all over Paradise. His gut told him to get people out. So the pair ran from house to house, banging on dozens of doors to alert people that they had to go. Some were still asleep. At half of the homes, no one answered. It took them 20 minutes, and when they were done, they got another call for a spot fire near the school district office on Clark Road. The streets were already crowded as they drove the 2 miles north. The blaze was still small by the time they arrived, and Shuki tried to put it out with the extinguisher. Nichols scanned the surroundings, vacant lots in the Kmart parking lot across the road. His heart sank. Another massive ponderosa, this one 50 feet in height, was swathed in flames from base to crown. Fierce gusts of wind scattered burning pine needles all around it. Nichols was not a man prone to melodrama, but at this moment he felt defeated. "We're done," he thought to himself.
Dani and I thought that we might talk a little bit about how we came to the book and what the writing process was like for us. And then we'd love to take your questions. The context of this book is the increasing intensity of wildfires in California and in the West more broadly, and in fact around the world, everywhere from Australia to the Mediterranean. And in California, over the last 10 to 15 years, if you speak to firefighters, what they'll tell you is every year seems to bring a fresh horror, a fire of an intensity that they hadn't known before. For one of the firefighters that we spoke to for the book, he told us about a fire. He worked in the 1970s or early 80s, and this fire was, I think, about 1,500 acres. And he said that at the time, that was a big fire in California. And he says, in comparison to the fires that we're seeing today, that fire was just a speck, he said, just a speck. We're now seeing regularly mega fires, fires of over 100,000 acres. Just last year, California had 5 of its 6 largest fires in history, in recorded history. And it's a pattern that's repeated in many Western states, as I'm sure you'll recall as well. Oregon and Washington also saw severe wildfires last year. The fire that occurred in Paradise was and is the deadliest US wildfire in 100 years, and it's the deadliest ever recorded in California. 85 people died. And the roots of this fire are complicated, but one very clear signal is that the environment, the landscape in California is ever drier, ever hotter. And wildfire scientists say that this is contributing to fires of extreme intensity and of extreme fire behavior as well. We recount in the book how people saw fire tornadoes during the fire that destroyed Paradise, and that in fact fire tornadoes are now much more commonly being seen and reported on in California. So in 2018, when the fire broke out, I'll just speak for me, and then of course Dani can take over. I was an editor at The Guardian, and I had been at The Guardian for a couple of years, and I lived in California for 10 years, and I had been reporting on the magnificent Western landscape in various stories. And I most enjoyed those stories that took me out into the Sierra Nevada mountains, into the incredible natural environment around the Bay Area where I lived. And I think what people who live in the West are aware of, and perhaps is less common knowledge elsewhere, is that actually fire is a real natural part of the landscape in the West. In fact, the ecology has really, it needs fire. There are certain tree species, for example, and these include redwoods, where giant sequoias, where the seeds require heat in order to open. And there are certain flowers that only germinate in the presence of the charred compounds that occur after a fire. So this is an environment that has evolved to live with fire, that needs fire. And so the fact that there are wildfires in California is not surprising. It's the intensity. And at The Guardian, reporting on this, editing stories about wildfires, it was increasingly apparent that we were seeing something different. Just a year or two before the fire in Paradise, there had been an enormous fire tornado that had destroyed a neighborhood in the town of Redding. There had been wine country fires that killed dozens of people in and around the town of Santa Rosa. And then on the morning of November 8th, 2018, there were signs that something else was going on in the town of Paradise, which is about 3 hours northeast of San Francisco. And I'll turn it over to Dani.
Sure. So to give you a little background on me to kind of lead to that part of the story, I have worked with The Guardian since the summer of 2018. And before that, I came from a newspaper in Chico, California, which is about 10 miles down the road from Paradise. Chico is where I grew up. It's where all of my family lives. And as a reporter there, I covered quite a few wildfires. There were a few deadly wildfires in the year leading up to the Camp Fire, as Alastair mentioned. And so I covered some of those. And in November, I had been with The Guardian for a few months when I went to work one morning and I started getting texts from my cousin asking me to pray for her hometown because there was a fire that she had heard about that was coming near Paradise. And knowing what I knew about Paradise, which was that it was a town with a larger proportion of retirees, of older people, a larger percentage of disabled people, and that the geography of the town means that it has limited ways in and out. It's on a ridge in the Sierra Nevada, and there are about 3 main roads that you can take to get down to the valley. So when this fire came, it basically swept over this town and caught people completely unaware. It was early in the morning, and by the time people realized that there was a fire, it was pretty much time for them to go. That's how rapidly the fire came to the town and, started setting these spot fires like we referenced in that bit of the book. So when that happened, I started getting messages from family and friends, and I went to my editors at The Guardian and said, hey, there's this fire, it's gonna be really bad, and you should probably let me cover it since that's my backyard and where I grew up, which is ultimately what happened. I drove up to the area, and even before I left the Bay Area, as Alastair mentioned, the Bay Area is about 3.5 hours southeast of Paradise. You could smell the smoke from our office in Oakland. And so driving north, I could smell it the whole time, and it was getting thicker and thicker. And by the time I was probably 40 or 50 miles from Paradise, still in the valley, I drove basically into darkness. The sky was this purplish, reddish, very unnatural color that was really off-putting. And then I started covering what was happening there, interviewing people who had been displaced, going into the town as it was still burning. And slowly we put the pieces together that what had happened was this fire swept over the town. About 27,000 people in Paradise alone needed to get out right away. They tried to evacuate on very small, on the very limited number of roads they had out of town. And basically people got stuck right away. The roads, it was just total gridlock as tens of thousands of people tried to flee. And from there, for the people that did get out, they had nowhere to go. Their homes were in danger, their friends and families' homes were in danger. And so it created this, basically this group of migrants or refugees who were trying to seek shelter while firefighters were trying to take on this massive undertaking of this huge fire. So as I said, from there, I covered the fire for several weeks, going to, for instance, the local Walmart that had kind of become this refugee camp for people. Fire survivors were sleeping outside on the lawn and in tents and in their cars because they had nowhere else to go. And during that time, Alastair and I joined forces and started covering the fire together, and wrote the piece that eventually led to our book on this topic, Fire in Paradise. And so we've continued covering basically the aftermath of this fire for the last 2.5 years. And kind of what we've seen is that this is a crisis that is still unfolding today. It's created a housing crisis in that part of Northern California where people are still struggling to find housing. They're still struggling to rebuild their lives, and they're still dealing with trauma. So as California's wildfires worsen, and last year we saw 4 million acres burned, and very close to Paradise, we saw 16 people die in another wildfire. While that's happening, these people in these areas are still trying to put the pieces back together from what happened in 2018.
One other thing I'd mention is I'd love to talk about what it was like to be co-authors as well, because this was one of my first experiences of that, working so closely with another colleague. And as Dani mentioned, we joined forces a couple of weeks after, and it's been one of the most amazing professional experiences of my career. I think Dani and I, we'd known each other a little bit before the book, but we, by the end of it, there was one phone call I remember close to the book being published where we had to do final fact checks and copy edits on the book, and we got on the phone call together at 10 p.m. and we put the phone down at 7 a.m. the next morning. We had been on the phone working through it the entire night. And so that was also a really remarkable part of writing this book. It was telling the story of this town, evoking what was lost, while working also with a really exceptionally talented colleague at The Guardian. So that was one of the, that was one of the most fascinating things. And I would just say as well, what we tried to do with the book, as well as tell the hard stories, the stories of loss, we also wanted to tell the stories of heroism, the stories, the human stories, the people who made it through, who saved themselves, their neighbors, their animals, other people's animals, who weathered something really, frankly, apocalyptic. And so we hope that that comes through in the book as well, not just the difficult parts, but also how people's humanity really shone through. And so we can take some questions now. Dani, do you want to take there's one about PG&E?
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, I see the questions now. Right. Okay. So PG&E's role in the fire. So when that fire started on the morning of November 8th, what happened basically was a faulty piece of PG&E equipment, a piece of equipment that was estimated to be about 100 years old, this transmission tower. That piece of equipment failed, and it sparked this blaze during a weekend where the fire risk was very high. And so that led to this massive conflagration that destroyed, more than 14,000 homes, killed 85 people. And if you follow wildfires in California, what you see is that in the last few years, PG&E has been responsible for fires time and time again. I think just about a week or two ago, they were found, a piece of their equipment was found responsible for another fire. But this fire was different. It was so deadly. The devastation was so immense. The town of Paradise was mostly destroyed. And so PG&E's role in that fire became clear pretty quickly. And essentially what happened from there is, PG&E was facing billions of dollars in liabilities. The utility was facing this reckoning of people asking why can't our utility companies not start fires, So what happened from there is PG&E declared bankruptcy. PG&E was sued by many of the people who survived the fire and relatives of people who did not. And where we are today, basically, is that PG&E has pled guilty to 84 counts of manslaughter. And they are now in the very early stages of paying the lawsuit, of settling the lawsuit. So victims are just starting to get the first bit of their settlements. And it's really a lifeline for a lot of people because, people are, as I said, still living in poverty. People lost everything and are also dealing with the trauma of having lost their town and their loved ones. So this settlement money that's coming in is very badly needed. And, time and time again, every fire season, people keep asking, well, what can we do to make PG&E safer? And in the last couple of years, PG&E has started doing these public safety power shutoffs, where essentially in areas that are, prone to fire and where the fire risk is going to be high, so meaning it's going to be, windy and dry, PG&E will just shut the power off. But what that means is that you have thousands of people kind of trying to scramble and live without power. In the last couple of years, tens of thousands of people have been affected by these. And it's often, again, people in poverty and people with disabilities who are really struggling when this happens.
And actually, just to add to what Dani said, in our paperback, which comes out tomorrow, we have a new afterword that we wrote, and it rounds out the story of PG&E a little bit more, because after we published the hardback version, this raft of absolutely fascinating documentation and court proceedings came out that we really scrutinized, and it exposes a real criminal, well, judged to be, the company was judged to be criminally liable, but the real astonishing recklessness of the company. I'm sure many people on this call will remember the movie Erin Brockovich, and it's PG&E, the electric utility, was also the company that was found responsible for polluting groundwater in a town in Southern California. And so it's a company with already a famous history of being reckless when it comes to safety. And the documentation that came out showed that, just to give you one example, previously power lines like the one that destroyed the town of Paradise had been inspected frequently from helicopters, and by, one person said sometimes we were so close on a helicopter that you could reach out and touch the power lines. And then after cost-cutting measures, after reviews of the safety program, 10 years later, none of that was happening. None of those inspections were happening. And as the questioner points out in their question, there's a fundamental conflict here for power companies like PG&E, which is owned by investors, although it has a public safety duty. And so there's always this conflict between it's expected to deliver a profit, to deliver returns to investors, and on the other hand, it's expected to invest in safety. But there's a fundamental conflict there. How can the power company customers be assured that it's investing everything in safety and not delivering returns to its investors? And that's a conundrum that I think has yet to be solved, although there have been countless suggestions around it, everything from breaking the company up to reforming the oversight board. But as of yet, there hasn't really been a solution. Well, there's a related question here, actually, which is about, the questioner asks, I presume the PG&E problem is because the power lines are above ground and therefore subject to falling and shorting. Are there any talks about moving the power lines below ground as they do in Europe? I realize it will cost a lot of money, but may still be better in the long run. That's really interesting. They are actually doing that in Paradise. That was part of the deal that was negotiated, is that PG&E will underground all of the power lines in Paradise. What's interesting, though, is that that's not a foolproof solution. To get pretty technical, there are two kinds of power lines. Largely in California, there are the really heavy-duty power lines that transport power between regions, and then there are the smaller lines that deliver it to individual homes and individual businesses. And in Paradise, they are undergrounding those much smaller power lines, which deliver power to individual homes. But actually, the power line that shorted and caused the Paradise campfire was one of those very heavy-duty transmission lines outside of town, and those aren't being undergrounded, and it's very hard, and it's just extremely expensive. I don't even know if they can be undergrounded. Dani may know better than I do, but all of which is to say that is happening in some areas affected by fires, but it's not a foolproof solution.
We have a question about the steps that California towns and counties are taking to prepare for the next fire season. So things are looking kind of grim going into this fire season. The analyses that fire scientists are doing are basically finding that fuels are very dry. California is not getting enough rain. And what's going to happen is these plants dry out and they become very flammable. So a lot of different towns and counties are preparing for this by doing kind of vegetation management projects, which is basically clearing out brush, clearing out dead trees. And California is actually working on this huge undertaking going forward, where the governor has put aside, $500 million to toward this for fire mitigation efforts, and hiring, I think, something like 1,300 new firefighters this season. And we'll see what happens going forward, and if that's enough. I think the experts that we have talked to basically say that one of the best tools we have in this is good fire. So basically using fire as a tool to try to clear out these overgrown dense forests. And that's something that they would really like to see more of introduced into the landscape. And actually what we saw last year is, even though so many millions of acres burned in California, some of the fire scientists we talked to actually say that some of those fires were good fires, right? They keep the landscape clearer and they prevent these mega fires from developing, or at least make them a lot less likely. So some different towns and counties are working on that as well.
There's an interesting question here, which I'll read out. So much of our discussion about American catastrophes are shaped by the stunning lack of resources being directed towards the relief efforts. Could you talk a little bit about the official response to this fire? What did it look like? Was it adequate? And if not, what does disaster relief need to look like as the effects of climate change continue to grow? Well, there was an enormous relief effort here. Everything from the firefighting effort to FEMA getting involved. The firefighting effort itself was enormous. California has I think one of the largest air firefighting fleets in the world that was deployed. Hundreds and hundreds of fire engines were on the scene, bulldozers, thousands of firefighters. I mean, this fire, although the town was largely destroyed in a single day, the fire itself didn't go out for about 2 weeks. And throughout that whole period, with the area blanketed in smoke, thousands of firefighters were out there in the wilderness trying to put this fire out. And there was, immediately following the fire, about 50,000 people were displaced from Paradise and the surrounding towns. And there was what I think you could call, without too much of a stretch, a climate change refugee crisis. These people were displaced by a climate-inflected wildfire, and many thousands of them were displaced. President Trump did visit the town, and in one of the more remarkable moments, he toured the town of Paradise. He was shown around by the mayor, the governor of California, then Governor Jerry Brown was there. And Trump went up in front of the cameras and said, "What a town, the town of pleasure." And then he said it again, "The town of pleasure." And the mayor of Paradise and others could be heard saying in the background, "It's paradise." Despite that remarkable exchange, FEMA, for instance, did get involved. It housed many thousands of people. And there are still, literally today, about 100 families still living in FEMA trailers. And so the response was hearty. There was also a very significant response from the private sector. Everything from celebrity chefs throwing elaborate Thanksgiving meals for fire victims about a week and a half after the fire, to people simply turning up in parking lots with taco trucks offering to help people. But I think the questioner is getting at a point which is really interesting, which is that we throw a lot of resources at recovery. Would those dollars be better spent in preventative measures instead? And I think there's no doubt, as Dani just mentioned, the question of preventing fires. You can't prevent fires. In fact, fires are like rain; they will occur. They're part of the landscape, as we said. But preparing the landscape for a gentler kind of fire, a fire that is more controllable, is, in my view, a much better spend of dollars. That's what we need to be investing in. The Paradise Fire was, in fact, the most expensive natural disaster of 2018. So undoubtedly, preventative measures such as introducing prescribed burns, which is you essentially go out on a day when the weather is gentle and you burn away all the brush in a given area of forest, so that later, if another fire breaks out naturally by lightning or from a electrical transmission line, it's going to encounter this burned area and it'll slow the fire down. Those kinds of measures, experts say, are a much better way to spend the dollars.
There is a really important question here about, is there any effort to relocate residents to other areas where the fire danger is much less than in Paradise, and should Paradise have been built in the first place? Well, to give you kind of my personal view as someone who grew up in Chico, I always knew Paradise as this more affordable community. It was a place where families and older people could live, and they knew their money was going to go a little further there than it would down in the valley. And so Paradise developed out of that, and both this desire to kind of live in the woods, live among the natural beauty of the Sierras. So I think regardless of of whether or not Paradise should have been built. People are going to live there, right? And what happens is the more people move there, you have this town kind of develop out of that. And so I think my view on this is not really whether people should live there or not, but really how can we give them the tools to live there safely? You know, if you're going to have a house in a fire-prone area, what can you do to make sure that your house is A, going to be safer in a fire, and B, not spread embers that are going to take out your neighbor's house? And what that has to do with is really taking care of your land. In some cases, doing these kind of like smaller prescribed burns that Alastair mentioned. Not having stuff piled up around your house, making sure that your vents are secure so embers can't get in there. So there are things we can do to help people live safely there. And, you know, I think frankly, one of the issues too is just affordable housing. Even before this fire, housing in Butte County was getting very, very expensive, and it was pushing people further out into these rural, forested areas. So to answer the first part of the question about relocating residents, I think what we saw after the fire is very generally few returned to Paradise. There's pretty much not a lot left there. And so today, I think there's about maybe 3,000 or so people there, and maybe 4 out of the 27,000 people who were originally there. And so, you know, for a lot of people, they don't want to return. It's too traumatic. They don't want to live somewhere where there is a risk of fire. And so they've chosen to settle elsewhere down in the valley or move out of state. And the people who are there today, you know, I spend quite a bit of time in Paradise and go there at least a couple times a year. The people who I encounter there today are very determined to live there and very determined to rebuild their town, but also to do it safely. And I think it's something they can do.
There's a question here which I'll read out. As journalists, could you talk about the work of putting faces and individual stories to these kinds of large-scale catastrophes? Climate change is such an overwhelmingly large issue, and its scope makes it difficult to grasp. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the place of narrative and storytelling in the fight to make change on a policy and structural level. It's a great question because it really goes to the heart of what we set out to do once we started on this book, which was that we knew that people were going to connect with the story of what happened to Paradise only if we could find compelling human stories that really exemplified and elucidated what happened. And so actually, one of the things that we did when we started reporting on the book is we made a spreadsheet of all of the 85 people that we knew to have died. And we tried to get in touch with every single one of their relatives, because we thought that these were the people that had suffered the greatest in the fire, and that we wanted to be able to not only tell their stories to give an example of what happened, but also to preserve their memory in a way. It felt like a kind of memorial project as well. And so we turned up, we spoke to a lot of those people. I found some terrible stories. We also found some incredible stories. I mean, I'll mention one of them now. And the reason I'm telling you this is because the question is about the importance of individual stories to conveying the narrative of climate change. And this one story really, you know, was astonishing to me. It was of a firefighter. His name was Joe Kennedy. And speaking about climate change, he said that, you know, he's not like a progressive, liberal, traditionally progressive guy. He's from a small town in the Sierra Nevada. He's pretty centrist. And nevertheless, he said that what had struck him in his work as a firefighter was just, as I mentioned earlier, how much larger and more intense these fires were growing just over the course of his career. He said there's this term in firefighting, a career fire, and firefighters always talk about a career fire. It's the worst fire you've seen in your career. And he said that in his 3 or 4 years as a firefighter, he had seen a career fire almost every year. There was just, the fires were bigger and bigger. And his role was as a bulldozer driver. Joe Kennedy, by the way, I should mention, is an enormous, enormous guy. I think this is about 6'4", 6'5". He's built like, well, looks like he goes to the gym every day. He's enormous, very deep voice, very thoughtfully spoken, drives a bulldozer. And he described driving a bulldozer to me as like dancing. He said it's like you have to learn how to balance this very, very heavy piece of machinery and drive it very delicately. And the role of bulldozers and fires is you essentially, when you're fighting a fire, you have to create fire breaks in order to stop the fire spreading. You have to create a line where you basically dug up all the vegetation and all the undergrowth. So you're literally creating a physical barrier that the fire can't spread across. So on the morning of the fire, he was dispatched there. He made his way into the burning town while everybody else was trying to get out in the other direction. He directed some fire crews when he could see that there was a fire right behind them that he hadn't noticed. And then he heard a call over his radio. And it was a call from another crew, another fire engine in his crew. And the crew and the fire engine was saying, "We're trapped, we can't get out." And Joe Kennedy didn't know exactly where they were, but he had a vague idea. And so he started to drive his bulldozer towards where he thought this fire engine was. And on the way, the roads were completely packed with abandoned, burning vehicles. Some of them had bodies inside. But Joe, in order to clear the route for the trapped fire engine, he pushed all of these aside, into the ditches on either side of the road, even though that was very painful for him because of the victims he could see in the vehicles. And he encountered several people who were trying to escape the fire. Some of them wanted to get in his cab, but he said, "There's no room, you can't." But he anyway directed them to safety. And he started approaching the trapped fire engine. The fire engine, there were lots and lots of people inside the cab of that. There were the firefighters and people that had been rescued as well. It was so hot that the plastic on the outside of the cab was melting. The paint was flaking off. The wheels, I think, were at risk of melting. It was very hot inside the cab. But Joe Kennedy cleared all of these cars away, including a burning Prius, which I think he said was burning. It felt like it was burning at something like 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And he freed the cab and saved many, many lives in the process. And that story remained with me. I mean, Joe's stoicism, and also the fact that he said to me afterwards, he lives in a town nearby Paradise, and he said to me in a conversation we had in his fire station, he said, when the next fire comes for my town. And what was so striking about it was not that he said, it was that he said when and not if. He had learned from these fires just how extreme the fire behavior had become. And so that's one way to circle back to the question now of how you convey climate change through characters. I think it's through people like Joe Kennedy, whose own experiences had illuminated for him what a precarious situation we were in, in California and in the nation as a whole, whether it's threats from wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, you name it. And so, Dani, you also had some amazing experiences with people we met.
Yeah, one story I always love to tell is the story of this father and daughter named John and Sky Sedgwick. And if you've peeked at the book, that these are the people who we opened the book with. John was a former volunteer firefighter, an 82-year-old who still hadn't yet retired. And when he wasn't working down in Chico, he spent his time as a docent at the local history museum and playing music for the seniors at his church. And he was someone who was very involved with the community and loved the Ridge. He lived just north of Paradise in a town called Magalia. He had lived there for basically, I think, more than 70 years after his family moved there from San Francisco in the 40s. And he lived with his adult daughter, Sky, who had moved in with her dad a few years before the fire when she was having some health problems. And the day the fire struck, John knew what was happening. As a former firefighter, he had always feared this fire. When him and Sky would sit down for dinner, he would pray, "Please, Jesus, no fires today." And so on the morning of the 8th, when he saw the smoke coming through the canyon just across the street from his house, he woke up Sky, he told her to go, but he wouldn't leave. He wanted to stay and kind of keep an eye on things. And what John Sedgwick did that day was he went and helped neighbors who were trying to put out spot fires on their property. he went and saved the historic firehouse where he, did his volunteer work. He spent his whole day just driving around his neighborhood trying to help people, and then also helping out-of-town firefighters who had driven up from the Bay Area but didn't know the roads very well. And so he would say, hey, I was just over here and I can tell like the flames are coming from here. He spent all day doing that, all day, 82 years old, working, doing a lot of really hard physical work. And then that night he called his daughter Sky and told her that things were fine. They'd gotten kind of scary. Fire came right up to their house, but things were fine. But eventually, a few hours after that phone call, while firefighters right next to his house were trying to make a final stand to save this historic restaurant, this 100 and something year old restaurant right next to his house, this massive sort of wall of flames came toward them in the night, and ultimately John Sedgwick died in that fire. But it's a story that I think is so powerful because John Sedgwick lived in this area. He loved this area and did everything he could to save it. And the fact that he chose to stay and use his skills to try to save it is something that I think is really incredible, and that his family finds a lot of comfort in still.
There's a question, what is going on in Paradise now? Are people rebuilding their homes or are they leaving? Well, it's a real mixed bag. As Dani mentioned earlier, I think 3,000 to 4,000 people are back in Paradise of the original 27,000. And if you visit right now, it's a town transformed. Not only were many of the historical buildings left, were lost, but also the real, the heart of the town, the guts of the town were really, so many homes were lost, so many people left, so many relationships were ripped apart. I mean, one of the most moving points in the book was just people telling us about things they'd lost. And it wasn't just the physical things. It was, knowing that they had this neighbor they could go and have a coffee with every morning. It was knowing that little private walk through the woods to get them to the bus stop. It was 150 years of history in this town that were really ripped apart by that fire. And so people are moving back now. There was a massive clearance undertaking. And so right after the fire, with so many homes burned down, you would drive down many streets and all you would see all around you were just the ruins of house after house after house, with burned cars, burned tires in front of them, total devastation. In fact, some of the search and rescue teams that we spoke to who'd worked at the World Trade Center, they'd worked at some of the one of the space shuttle crash recovery sites, said that Paradise was really unlike anything they had ever seen. And it's really something that is rare to see in post-war, in post-war history in America, a town leveled to the ground. And so there has been this incredible clearance effort now. And so when you visit Paradise, it's actually quite beautiful in parts. I think Dani was telling me she was there just the other week, and all of these burnt out lots, they're now just open meadows, and you maybe have an occasional house and meadow after meadow after meadow. And there aren't very many people left there. And Dani, I'll let you take it away because you were just there, and maybe you could share some of your impressions.
Yeah, one of the things that is so striking to me, having seen Paradise in its various stages after the fire, one still burning, smoldering cars, then sort of just the remnants of that, and then finally empty lots. Today, what stands out to me when I go to Paradise is just the emptiness. You have these blocks that are completely clear, and then you get little hints of the town that was, there's half a block of little shops and that sort of thing. I would say when I was there most recently, earlier this month, it really felt like Paradise was kind of getting back on its feet. There were a lot of stores and restaurants that had reopened, still a lot, but fewer construction vehicles and that sort of thing. And you're seeing a lot of new homes, which is great because, those new homes are generally at less risk of burning. But still, I think Paradise is going to be such a different town. And that's one of the things people have told us from the very beginning is Paradise was a refuge for people who in many cases couldn't afford to live elsewhere and loved living in the natural beauty of the Sierras. And most people we have talked to have kind of acknowledged that, you know, it's not going to be the same now. It's going to be a different town, and it's probably going to be, you know, maybe a slightly more affluent town, not quite the refuge that it was before.
Some of the people we met are actually involved in are intimately involved in the recovery efforts, or are just boosters of the town. One of the people, I'm sorry, there's a lot of sunlight on my face. I hope you can see me okay. One of the people we profile in the book is a longtime Paradise resident called Iris Natividad, and she unfortunately lost someone in the fire. But after the fire burned through, she thought, maybe I'll return to Paradise, maybe I won't. She was really undecided about it. She thought of moving to the Oregon or Washington coast. She just thought of leaving the area. And she realized, in a sense, that she had unfinished business in Paradise, that she felt as though it was still part of her story. And so when I first met Iris, she was working in one of the very, very few stores that had survived and actually had reopened shortly after the police blockade, the emergency blockade of the area was lifted. It was an antique store called Treasures from Paradise. And Iris wasn't just selling sort of antiques and knickknacks, she's actually a specialist in decorative glass. She started getting into this whole line of products called Paradise Strong. She was selling teddy bears that said Paradise Strong and pieces of wood carved with Paradise Strong. She wants to buy a piece of land there and move back to Paradise. She wants to stay involved with the town. She's a booster for the town. She wants to open her own store there. There's a siren behind me if you can hear it. And so while a lot of people have been displaced, there are people like Iris who've decided to commit to the town.
There's not a question, but a very thoughtful comment from Judy about her family who lost homes in the fire and are still dealing with trauma. Yeah, it's an account that we hear time and time again from people. I mean, this was a life-shattering event for people. I think pretty much everyone we've talked to is still really fighting that trauma and trying to learn how to live with it and move forward. It's very difficult. And that kind of leads to another question about people who survived the fire but are having trouble rebuilding their lives. I think for that, you know, I'll just mention Skye, John Sedgwick's daughter, who I mentioned earlier. So the fire destroyed the land that she shared with her father, destroyed their historic home. And from there, she was really kind of out of a loss. You know, she bounced from friends of friends' houses to eventually she was placed in FEMA housing, where she has spent, I think, probably about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years now. And she's really still waiting for that PG&E settlement money to come in and rebuild her life. You know, she didn't have insurance money on the house. The house was so old, I think it was about 110 years old, that her father couldn't get insurance on it. And, you know, that's one of the things she's told me is that I'll be fine. But if I'm going to rebuild my life, I need that money to come in to kind of set that up. And she wants to go back to that land. So I think a lot of people are really holding out hope for that. Today, there continue to be some resources available for fire survivors. As we mentioned, people are still in FEMA housing, and I think they have extended that program through the fall. Millions and millions of dollars came into Butte County. Most of it was kind of funneled through this nonprofit called the North Valley Community Foundation, which has done really incredible work in the area and has, I think, some direct payment programs to help survivors. However, one of the things with that is a lot of the money that came into the county, rather than go directly to individuals, a good portion of it is going to the actual town to help the town rebuild. So that's why I think we still have so many people struggling. So though there are still resources, there are still basically there are disaster case managers who work with families to try to help them get back on their feet. I think just the level of destruction and the tens of thousands of people affected, even with that, it's still pretty difficult.
I think we might be at time now. Is that right?
Yes. Hi.
Well, I suppose I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank everyone for such thoughtful questions. It was really pleasurable just to engage with everyone like this. I wish it could be in person, but thank you for so much for all of these wonderful questions and thoughts. And our paperback is out tomorrow with a new afterword. So please pick it up if you're interested. And yeah, thank you so much to the Harvard Bookstore as well for hosting us.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really great to be able to talk to you all about this. And I really appreciate your continued interest in this. For thousands of people, this disaster is still a disaster. So I think continuing to pay attention to it and see what's happening there is so important. And it means a lot that you all took the time to do that.
Thank you. I just want to thank you both for sharing your reportage with us. And thank you to everyone out there for asking such thoughtful questions and spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this fascinating book and purchase the new to paperback Fire in Paradise at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.